Here we see the project lifecycle, a series of phases a project passes through from start to finish. This basic framework applies regardless of the specific type of work involved. Here we see a set of milestones that actually separate the different phases. Starting the project. Starting the project culminates at a milestone of having the charter prepared. Organizing and preparing culminates with the signing of a project management plan. Carrying out the work will end once we have an accepted deliverable, and ending the project will be complete when we have finished the final process of close project or phase. Some characteristics of a generic project lifecycle. The cost and staffing levels are low at the start, but as time passes, stakeholder influence and risk decrease. The reason for this is the more planning that we do, the less ability stakeholders have to force a change in some kind of way. Simultaneously, risk will also go down as planning goes up. If we think about this, it actually makes a lot of sense. If we were chartered to construct a new skyscraper in a metropolitan area, in the very beginning, stakeholder influence is going to be very high as we're collecting requirements and trying to figure out where are we going to build this, what should it look like, how large should it be. And risk will be extremely high because there's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know where it's going to go. We don't know if we can buy the land. We don't know if the land will be able to support a building of that size and weight. We're not sure if we'll be able to get the zoning permits or if there's going to be any environmental considerations so far as migratory birds or anything else. However, as we conduct planning, it's going to get more difficult for the stakeholders to make changes to it because the cost of change will go up. Imagine for a second, if you will, that we've completed quite a bit of feasibility study and the blueprints are halfway done, and a stakeholder wants to move the entire project to another metropolitan area. Is it possible to submit this change request? Absolutely. But it's going to become very expensive because all of the planning we've done thus far will have been wasted. So as time passes, the ability for stakeholders to influence a project in one direction or another will decrease. And the more planning that we do, the more the risk will decrease as well. We'll never be able to eliminate risk altogether, as risk is just the inherent uncertainty in a project, but we can go ahead and decrease it down to an acceptable level. So in a well-run project, we want stakeholder involvement very high in the beginning. If we do not capture stakeholder requirements in the beginning, we are introducing some very bad risk because we may still have to go ahead and do it. Just because a stakeholder does not give us the requirement does not mean that the requirement does not have to be fulfilled. If we complete our planning and then a stakeholder comes forward and says, I have some requirements for you, and if we have to include those, then we have to modify our plan. Now, anytime we modify the plan, we will go through formal change control, of course, but we will have second and third order effects. This reintroduces a lot of the risk that we have decreased through effective planning. As time passes, the stakeholder influence will decrease as we are managing their expectations and their level of engagement. The cost and staffing level will increase as the work is carried out. However, as a project draws to a close, it will drop rapidly. A very important note here is that practitioners and the people working as members of the project team will not just be released as soon as they're done working. This is going to be very methodical and deliberate in how we approach this. Anytime somebody completes their piece of the project work, we will inspect their work to ensure that it was done properly. We will gather lessons learned from that individual, and then we can go ahead and release them. But nobody's just going to walk off the job site. Risk will always be highest at the project's inception because risk is uncertainty. So in the beginning, we're going to have primarily risk. However, as we conduct planning and as work proceeds, risk will decrease. Risk is neutral. Risk is just uncertainty. If that uncertainty is inherently positive, we would call it an opportunity. At the same time, if the risk is inherently negative, we would call it a threat. The definition of tailoring is the appropriate combination of processes, inputs, tools, techniques, outputs, and lifecycle phases to manage a project. The PMBOK recognizes that not all projects are created equal. However, project managers apply some type of project management methodology to the work that they're managing. A methodology is a system of practices, techniques, procedures, and rules used by those who work in a discipline. The PMBOK is not a methodology. The project manager collaborates with the team, sponsor, organizational management, or some combination thereof in tailoring. And this is where we decide what is the specific project management methodology that we will use. Tailoring is necessary because each project is unique. That's because each deliverable is unique. If a project is exactly the same as a past project, then we kind of have to look at, is this more so operational work? In which case we may have defined processes. Tailoring is where we will modify processes accordingly based upon the importance of the constraints that we're facing for the project. These constraints are based upon the project's environment, organizational culture, stakeholder needs, and other variables. So some of the considerations that we have here. The competing constraints. With scope, schedule, resources, quality, and risk, we have to prioritize which one is our top concern. If there's a situation where stakeholders tell us that everything is a priority one, well, that's not necessarily true because we have to have a true priority one. If they tell us that scope cannot be compromised, that we must fulfill all requirements, then we will have to go ahead and be a bit more flexible with the schedule, resourcing, and the amount of money that we're willing to spend. If they tell us that the schedule, if we have a very hard, firm, externally imposed deadline, we must deliver by February 1st, no later than. In this type of situation, we may need a lot more money, or we may need the ability to de-scope as required. If money is a primary concern, if we cannot spend more than $2.5 million, we may need to move the schedule around, or we may also have the ability to de-scope some requirements. The project operating environment considers the various physical aspects of exactly where the work will be carried out. The organizational culture, which should be considered based upon the level of organizational maturity and how often we do project work. Levels of governance, based upon the presence or absence of a project, program, or portfolio management office. And finally, is it an internal or external customer? Depending on who's sponsoring the project and who has the signature authority to accept the deliverable, we may go ahead and decide to tailor processes in a different manner. Project phases. One of the ways that we may tailor a project is the selection of project phases. Again, because each project is unique, the project manager may need to tailor the way that the processes are applied. With the project lifecycle, we need to decide what is an appropriate project lifecycle. Should we have phases within a lifecycle? I like to describe a phase as being a project within a project, because with each phase, we will invoke all 5 process groups. We will go ahead and start it deliberately, and we will close it with the same formality that we would close a project. Each phase would have a deliverable that contributes to the overall project deliverable. Each phase will have processes within it. Processes that are used once or at predefined points could include developing the project charter or closing the project or phase. These are done a single time. We will develop a charter in the beginning, and we will close the project or phase at the end. Some phases are done periodically as needed, such as acquiring resources when resources are needed, or conducting procurements when we need to purchase something. Other processes are done continuously throughout the project. Defining activities may occur throughout the project lifecycle, especially when we're using a type of rolling wave planning. Also, the majority of the monitoring and controlling processes are ongoing from the start of the project until the project closes. With phase-to-phase relationships, some phases may be sequential. If we're getting ready to construct a skyscraper, it is unlikely that we are going to start excavating the foundation and laying concrete until we have blueprints completed. So we're going to wait until the designing is done before construction begins. But we may have some situations where we have phases that overlap. For example, if we're conducting a feasibility study, and that feasibility study is about 80% complete, and it looks like we're going to have a favorable result, we may be able to start the following phase a little bit early by contracting with a real estate firm to purchase the land, an architect to go ahead and start designing the structure. This doesn't mean that we're buying anything yet, we're just getting the ball rolling. This allows us to get a little bit of a head start. We could also see iterative phases. With iterative processes within the phases, the relationship can be either sequential or continuous overlapping. With iterative, requirements can be elaborated at periodic intervals during delivery. This is going to allow the phase relationships to be either sequential or continuously overlapping. Here we see an example of 4 phases. Again, we should think about each phase as a project within a project. With each phase, it's a division of the project. It's basically a project within a project because we will be doing all 5 process groups within each. It will be a collection of logically related project activities, and it will complete one or more deliverable that contributes to succeeding phases and the overall project deliverable. So for example, if we were attempting to design a new type of smartphone, we would begin with a feasibility study to determine the high-level requirements given to us by the stakeholders. Are they achievable based upon our organizational capability and current technology? The feasibility study would be the deliverable and the output of that phase. This would go into our design phase. This is where we would actually go ahead and have the engineers start putting together a prototype. The prototype, when completed, we would evaluate this with our stakeholders and determine would this deliver value to them. If yes, it would become an input to the develop phase. Here we would further streamline it and basically fulfill any further requirements that we have, eventually moving to the deployment phase. At the end of this, all of the deliverables from the preceding phases are being added to incrementally until we have a completed project deliverable that gives our customer some type of value. Project phases should not be confused with process groups. As we see here, each phase invokes all 5 process groups. At the end of each phase, we have a phase gate and possible kill point. A phase gate is a review at the end of a phase where we make a determination whether to continue to the next phase to do some type of modification or to go ahead and terminate the project or program. This is going to be pretty important because obviously if the feasibility study is coming back unfavorable, there's not a whole lot of reason to move on to design and spend time, money, and effort doing work that will never be able to deliver what our customer wants. Here we see the project and development life cycles. The predictive life cycle is also known as waterfall. It's called waterfall because if we view this on a Gantt chart, we could kind of imagine water cascading down. This progresses through a series of sequential or overlapping phases where changes are carefully managed. Predictive life cycle is useful when the requirements can be fixed and the activities are performed once for the entire project. The primary goal of the predictive life cycle is to manage the project's cost. The iterative life cycle is where scope is determined early with time and cost updated as understanding of the final product increases. This is because the requirements will be a bit more dynamic. The product is developed through series of repeated cycles. The reason that we're doing these repeated cycles is to ensure that we are having the correctness of whatever solution it is that we're doing. We'll continue to repeat these cycles until we ensure that, yes, these are correct. Incremental delivery is where the product is developed through a series of iterations that add functionality within a predetermined time frame. Again, we're dealing with some type of dynamic requirements. The product is considered complete only after the final iteration. So the focus here becomes very small deliveries of increasing value as time passes, and the focus is truly on the speed of that delivery. Once we get to the adaptive, also known as the change-driven or agile, this is where we will use iterative and incremental methodologies, but the iterations occur more rapidly and are fixed in time and cost. For example, a 30-day sprint. Several processes are performed in each iteration, but early iterations may focus more on planning. Again, this is where the requirements may be very dynamic, but we want to have a lot of customer interaction, and this is typically done through the use of a person known as a product owner. This allows the customer to achieve more value through frequent deliveries and feedback. We can go ahead and continue this until we have something that would be deemed acceptable. Finally, we have the hybrid life cycle. This is a combination of predictive and adaptive life cycle. The elements that are well known or have fixed requirements follow predictive, and those still evolving follow adaptive. This allows a project manager to take advantage of the benefits of these different types of life cycles. It's important to remember that it is not necessary to use a single approach for the entire project. We can use a combination of any or all of these approaches, and it would be considered a hybrid approach. The product life cycle. It's important to note that the project life cycle is independent of the product life cycles. The product may be produced by a project, but a product life cycle is a series of phases that represent the evolution of a product, from concept through delivery, growth, maturity, and eventual retirement and decline. This is going to be true for pretty much anything that you can think of. Any model car, any smartphone, computer, software, everything has an introduction, growth, maturity, and eventual decline. While the project lifecycle and the product life cycles are independent of one another, projects can intersect with the product lifecycle at various times, such as perhaps introducing a new product or at the end of the product lifecycle.